last week we just barely got started into Genesis chapter 27. But before we did that, we looked in some depth at the genealogy of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, in chapter 36. And we learned that Esau's descendants intermarried to a significant degree with Ishmael's descendants, meaning that most of the peoples of the Middle East today have some mixture of Ishmael's and Esau's blood in their veins. And while it may be difficult for us to look through scientific and rational eyes and say that it is an almost natural outcome that the descendants of the two dispossessed sons of the patriarchs, Ishmael and Esau, would be in constant opposition to the descendants of the chosen and blessed sons of the patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob, the fact is, this is exactly what has occurred. It's undeniable. Those modern-day descendants of Ishmael and Esau carry a hatred for the modern-day people of Jacob, Israel, that is both historical and it's spiritual in its origin. In Genesis 27, starting at verse 38, we read this. And Esau said to his father, "Do you have only one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, my father." So Esau lifted his voice and he wept. And then Isaac, his father, answered and said to him, "Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, away from the dew of heaven from above. And by your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall come about, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck." Notice that last verse. That it shall come about, Esau, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck. This is what's going on in front of our eyes, displayed day after day on our TVs. Esau, Palestinians, are restless. They don't want to be under Israel's yoke, which is how they see themselves. And they are in process of breaking that yoke from their necks and having their own sovereign nation, and they're going to succeed for a time. But as I've told you in past lessons, all we see happening in the Middle East today is a result of God's division, election, and separation between Isaac and Ishmael, and then between Esau and Jacob. And it is also the result of these prophetic blessings that happened 3,500 years ago and more. And no amount of peace overtures and UN councils and treaties and resolutions and boycotts against Israel is going to bring any of this to a happy ending. God's plan is not that he'll give men a chance to work it out. And then if we can't, he'll intervene. Although, in fact, that is the theology of some thoroughly confused denominations. This will only be worked out when God intervenes. Now, some time ago, someone said to me that if it is true that all that is happening in the Middle East must happen, and that our only hope for peace is not mankind, but it rests entirely on the return of our Messiah, then why should we take sides with Israel and against the Palestinians or the Muslims or Iran or whoever is trying to destroy Israel? Why should we even pay much attention at all to what is going on other than out of curiosity? Because it's all destined to happen anyway, regardless of what we think. Well, that person has a valid point. Yeshua said that the end would not come and he would not return until all things that must happen does happen. So what is our role in all this as his followers? In a way, this is a time of testing for us. God does choose sides. He does make divisions that create sides. He demands that all mankind choose one side or the other. Are we for Yeshua or are we against him? Is where the first and most important choice lays. As believers, we are called to trust God and trust his word. But our choosing doesn't end with Yeshua. The next most important spiritual choice for us is where we stand on Israel and on his people, the Jews. Jehovah made it clear that those who bless Israel, the land and the people, will be blessed. Those who curse Israel will be cursed. God does not tolerate neutrality. Christ says in Revelation, I'd rather you were hot or cold, but you're just tepid. So I spit you out of my mouth. All one has to do is to read the Holy Scriptures to know what choice is expected of us. Yet, just as Moses commanded Israel not to hate Esau, your kinsman, not to hate those who side against Israel. We don't have to hate the Muslims. We don't have to hate the Palestinian people in order to side with Israel. Well, as the era of the patriarchs comes to a close, chapter 37 presents us with Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob. And Jacob picks up where the patriarchs left off. Joseph will be the focus now for the remainder of Genesis. Let's read Genesis 37 from the beginning. Genesis chapter 37, if you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 41. We're going to read it all. Yaakov continued living in the land where his father had lived as a foreigner, the land of Canaan. Here's the history of Jacob. When Joseph was 17 years old, he used to pasture the flock with his brothers, even though he was still a boy. Once when he was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now, Israel loved Joseph the most among all of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long-sleeved robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they began to hate him, and it reached the point where they couldn't even talk with him in a civil manner. Joseph had a dream, which he told his brothers, and that made them hate him all the more. And he said to them, "Listen while I tell you about this dream of mine. We were tying up bundles of wheat out in the field when suddenly my bundle got up by itself and it stood upright. Then your bundles came and gathered around mine, and they prostrated themselves before it." And his brothers retorted, "Oh yes, you will certainly be our king, and you'll do a great job of bossing us around." And they hated him still more for his dreams and for what he said. He had another dream, which he told his brothers. "Here, I had another dream, and there were the sun and the moon and the 11 stars prostrating themselves before me." And he told his father too, as well as his brothers, and his father rebuked him. "What is this dream you've had? Do you really expect me, your mother, and your brothers to come and prostrate ourselves before you on the ground?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. After this, when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's sheep in Shechem, Israel asked Joseph, "Aren't your brothers pasturing the sheep in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he answered, "Here I am." And he said to him, "Go now, see whether things are going well with your brothers and with the sheep, and bring word back to me." So he sent him away from the Hebron valley, and he went to Shechem, where a man found him wandering around in the countryside. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for my brothers," he answered. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the sheep?" And the man said, "They've left here, because I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dotan.'" Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dotan. Well, they spotted him in the distance, and before he had arrived where they were, they had already plotted to kill him. And they said to each other, "Look, this dreamer is coming. So come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these water cisterns here. Then we'll say some wild animal devoured him. We'll see then what becomes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard of this, he saved him from being destroyed by them. He said, "We shouldn't take his life. Don't shed blood." And Reuben added, "Throw him into the cistern here in the wilds. But don't lay hands on him yourselves." Now he intended to rescue him from them later and restore him to his father. So it was that when Joseph arrived to be with his brothers, they stripped off his robe, the long-sleeved robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat their meal, but as they looked up, they saw in front of them a caravan of Ishmaelites, coming from Gilad, their camels loaded with aromatic gum and healing resin and opium, and on their way down to Egypt. And Yehuda said to his brothers, "What advantage is it to us if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites instead of putting him to death with our own hands. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." Well, his brothers paid attention to him. So when the Midianites, merchants, passed by, they drew and lifted Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for half a pound of silver shekels to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph out into Egypt. Reuben returned to the cistern, and upon seeing that Joseph wasn't in it, tore his clothes in mourning. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I go now?" They took Joseph's robe, they killed a male goat and dipped the robe in blood. Then they sent the long-sleeved robe and brought it to their father, saying, "We found this. Do you know if it's your son's robe or not?" He recognized it and he cried, "It is my son's robe. Some wild animal has torn Joseph in pieces and eaten him." Yaakov tore his clothes and, putting sackcloth around his waist, mourned his son for many days. Though all his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, he refused all consolation, saying, "No, I will go down to the grave, to my son, mourning." And his father wept for him. In Egypt, the Midianim sold Joseph to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, a captain of the guard. In verse 2, we're told that 17-year-old Joseph brings back a bad report about certain of his brothers, and he gives it to his father. In other words, he tattled on him. Does anybody here have a younger brother or sister that just couldn't wait to find something to run to mom and dad to tell on about you? Well, I did. Well, that's the situation here. Notice something else. These particular brothers who were tattled on were not the sons of Jacob's legal wives, Leah and Rachel. They were the sons of Jacob's two concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. That could not have helped but cause additional stress and strain on the relationships between all the sons of Jacob, who were born by 4 different mothers. Imagine the problems in this family. But there is also a subtle change in family status that shows up in the Hebrew. Because for the first time, Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob's concubines, are now called Ishisha, which is a term usually only applied to a legal wife. Now, I can't say it with 100% assurance, but unless this is a redaction or it's an anomaly, it appears that Jacob had made Bilhah and Zilpah full wives. The Rambam, Maimonides, says that at the time of this story of Joseph, both Leah and Rachel were deceased. If this is correct, and it is more probable than not that it is correct, then we understand why Jacob might have elevated the status of Bilhah and Zilpah. We also understand all the more the terrible turmoil that must have existed within Jacob's family at this time. Now, because Jacob had always favored Rachel, he also favored the 2 children she gave him, Joseph and Benjamin, especially Joseph. Now, we're told in verse 3 that Jacob loved Joseph more. Apparently made no bones about making that fact very clear. And further signified Joseph's favor by giving him what most Bibles will call a coat of many colors. Actually, it's not a coat at all, it's a tunic. It's a ketonet pasim. But there are many types of tunics, ranging from the ordinary to the special. Even more, there was a tunic that went from the neck to the ankle and all the way to the wrists on the arms. This was a royal tunic. And the form of the Hebrew used here says that indeed this was a royal robe, a royal tunic. Now imagine now. This wasn't that Joseph got a little nicer coat than his brothers got. It was his father virtually anointing him as the little prince. And he had him prancing around among his brothers in that kingly garb. The jealousy and the envy that this was bound to cause was going to wind up nearly costing Joseph his life. In fact, the envy grew into hatred of Joseph to the point, as it says in verse 4, that his brothers couldn't speak to him anymore on friendly or even civil terms. Jacob's actions is almost an obsessive preference of Joseph. And it made Joseph not fit in with his brothers. Literally, the translation is, they could not get themselves to address him unto peace. Much like it is in the Middle East today, back in that time, the common greeting was, peace be with you. What this verse is saying is that these brothers couldn't even bring themselves to offer Joseph the standard peace be with you greeting because they loathed him so much. It's within this context that we have to view what's about to transpire. Somehow Joseph was at least somewhat aloof to all this rage and this hatred that surrounded him, and in a kind of youthful naivete, Joseph didn't have the good sense to keep his mouth shut on an occasion in which he had a dream, the meaning of which was sure exciting to him, but it wasn't going to be very exciting to his brothers. And in this dream, he sees sheaves, he sees bundles of harvest grain of some sort. There were 12 of these sheaves, 11 of them bowing down to the 12th. Now picture this teenaged Joseph standing there in his regal tunic, all full of himself, telling this story to his 10 older brothers who knew full well what this dream symbolism was. That is, someday they were going to all submit to Joseph as their master. Here we see how God will communicate to Joseph. He's going to do it in dreams and visions, as opposed to the more direct, audible, even two-way conversations he had with the patriarchs. But we also need to understand this was not unique to Joseph. Dreams and visions were standard ways that people of that era thought, at least, that their God or gods communicated with him. And people generally believed these prophetic visions. But it is also understood that the personality and ambitions of the dreamer played a significant role in the dream. Therefore, a dream was kind of a hybrid thing. It was an oracle or a prophecy that was part God and part of the aspirations of the person having the dream. In verse 9, he has another dream. Once again, he just can't wait to tell everybody about it. The first dream he only told to his brothers. This dream he relates to his father, Jacob, as well. Now he says that the sun and the moon and 11 stars bow down to him. They again knew full well what that meant. But it was even more insulting because in that era, and actually right down to pagan religions of our day, the sun represented the father figure, the moon, the mother figure, the stars, their offspring. So Joseph was now saying that not only would his brothers bow down in subservience to him, so would his own mother and father. Jacob tries to rein in Joseph's self-importance a little bit by mocking him. And he says to him, "Are we to come, I and your mother, and bow low to the ground to you?" Now his whole family must have thought Joseph was losing it, suffering from delusions of grandeur. In fact, as it will turn out, these dreams were accurate. And that dream interpretation was a spiritual gift from God for Joseph. And by the way, this passage lends credence that Bilhah and Zilpah had become wives, legal wives, for Jacob, because although Rachel was long dead before this incident, here we see Jacob respond with, "So You say, I and your mother shall bow down to you. Rachel was Joseph's mother, but Bilhah had been her handmaiden. Bilhah would have had much to do with Joseph's upbringing. If Jacob had elevated Bilhah's status to a full wife, it would have been customary in that era to refer to her now as Jacob's mother, or rather Joseph's mother, pardon me. Now apparently the flocks of the Israelite clan were at this time pasturing in the grassy fields and valleys that surround Shechem, beautiful place, while the home base was in Hebron. And Joseph's brothers were off tending the animals. Now, I find it kind of interesting that Jacob and his sons apparently felt no compunction in going back to Shechem, considering that just a few years earlier, the king of Shechem's son had raped Jacob's daughter, Dinah. And in retaliation, the sons of Jacob had slaughtered every male resident in that city, taken many of their widows and children for their own. Israel, Jacob, told Joseph to go to his brothers and check on their welfare. The reason for Jacob sending Joseph could well have been that he was concerned for his sons in light of that horrible incident. In the Middle East, the desire for vengeance goes on for generations. Well, off goes Joseph, unaware of the precarious situation he's in. It was a journey of about 50 miles, and as he gets near Shechem, a man informs him that the flock had been there, but it's moved on now to a place called Dothan. Two things. First, despite a few movie versions to the contrary, this man was only a man. The Hebrew word was ish, man. So this was not an angel. Second, the place called Dothan means two wells, and Joseph was about to have a close encounter with one of those wells. Now, the area of the two wells was hilly and it was lush. And apparently from a vantage point atop one of those hills, the brothers saw Joseph coming from a distance towards them. Now, their hatred just overflowed. Now, dear old dad was at least 3 days' journey away, and even before Joseph reached him, they decided, we're going to kill that guy. Verses 19 and 20 show us rather clearly what it was that finally put them over the edge. It was those dreams of Joseph that offended them to the point of murder. Now, let's be clear. This is not only about jealousy and insult. These brothers believed, to some degree, that the dreams of Joseph being their master were true. If they killed Joseph, problem solved. Now, Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob and a son of Leah, intervened. And he suggested they not kill Joseph by their own hands, but rather they just throw him into a pit, with the idea being forwarded that Joseph would just starve to death in that pit and never be found. Now, the Bible tells us that Reuben's real intention was not to have Joseph die, but that he would come back later, retrieve him after his brothers had left the area. Let's remember here that Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, was the one who attempted a coup against his father by sleeping with Bilhah, thereby claiming his father's concubine as a prize. And after the coup failed, and apparently after both Rachel and Leah died, Jacob ignored the fact that Bilhah was considered ruined, according to tradition, and he married her anyway. Now, Reuben was obviously still considered the top dog among his brothers. So, it's kind of interesting that Reuben, who had the most to lose with his father's special preference for Joseph, that he would be the one who tried to intervene and come to Joseph's rescue. Besides, as the oldest brother, Reuben would have been held responsible for the actions of the group, and he was in enough hot water as it was because of the Bilhah affair. Well, it might be interesting to note here that the pit was in fact an empty well, a cistern. Now remember, the place where they were was called Dothan, two wells. Apparently, one of those two wells was dry, because we're informed as much in verse 24. Now, dry wells and cisterns were commonly used as prison cells, sometimes as hiding places in that day. So Reuben's idea was hardly novel. Well, a couple of chapters ago, we got a pretty good glimpse as to the hardened individuals that these brothers were. They had slain all the males of Shechem after the men had been duped into being circumcised, and then they were weakened by its after effects. Then they went on to rampage and loot this helpless city, even carry off some of its women and children to use to increase the size of their own families. So it should be of little surprise that these same pitiless men would have thrown their teenage brother into an empty well to die, then immediately sit down to have lunch as his pleas for mercy hang in the air. No sooner had they begun to eat than they spot a caravan of Ishmaelite Arab traders. With this, Judah, another son of Leah, has an idea. Let's not allow him to die in that pit. Let's sell him to the Arabs. That way, whatever happens to him from this point is beyond our control. I mean, what fractured logic we got here. Besides, can they actually profit monetarily by getting rid of Joseph this way? Yeah, they can. So why not do it? Well, incidentally, the idea that it would be such a great coincidence for these traders to come along out of the middle of nowhere is not at all far-fetched. For one of the oldest trading routes of the Middle East ran through from the spice-producing region of Gilad, down through the area of Shechem, right where they were located, and then all the way down into Egypt. So this was a regularly traveled route. So the brothers sold Joseph to the traders for 20 shekels of silver, the going rate for a male slave. Reuben returns, he finds Joseph gone, and tore his garment, a sign of mourning. Now, this is not so much because he laments that Joseph is gone, but as the eldest, he's going to be held responsible for this by his father, Jacob. The brothers now put blood on that royal tunic that they stripped from Joseph before they threw him down to the well. They take it to their father, asking, "Is this Joseph's tunic?" Of course, Jacob immediately identified the tunic as Joseph's. The blood on the tunic was proof enough, to Jacob at least, that a wild animal had killed and eaten Joseph, such that the brothers didn't even have to tell their lie. Rather, they offered their father comfort. But Jacob couldn't be comforted, and he gives us a little hint of how people of his day viewed death. He says rhetorically that surely he shall now die, but then he shall go down to Sheol to be with his son Joseph. At that time, Sheol basically meant the grave or the place of the dead. The concept of dying and going to heaven did not exist. As we have seen in recent chapters, there is a concept of dying and being gathered to your people, a statement associated with the nearly universal practice in that era of ancestor worship. Now, exactly what that meant to the mind of these ancients, I'm unsure. But certainly it carries with it the idea of some type of life after death, even if they were unclear as to what that amounted to. Well, one thing about this chapter that gives us a little bit of trouble, it alternates between saying that the brothers sold Joseph to Ishmaelites and that they sold him to Midianites. Ishmaelites were a different people than the Midianites. Ishmael was son of Abraham, as was Midian. But Ishmael's mother was Hagar, while Midian's mother was Keturah. Perhaps Ishmaelites had already become a general term for all the Semitic peoples living in the area of Arabia, and Midianites was more specific. It was kind of a precise identification. They're just not sure. In any case, in the last verse, we see Joseph arrive in Egypt, and he gets sold to a very high Egyptian government official named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar is a rather common Egyptian name, and it is found on Egyptian monuments from several dynasties. Written Pet Pa-Ra. It simply means dedicated to Ra, or a gift to Ra, and Ra was the Egyptian sun god. Now, it's often debated as to exactly what office Potiphar held for the Pharaoh, but it for certain had something to do with the military. Now, whether he was a captain of the palace guard, or he was in charge of all Pharaoh's armies, or simply the Pharaoh's chief bodyguard, none of this is clear. But he was probably, at least at this moment, the second most powerful man in Egypt. For the moment, anyway. Now let's go to chapter 38, which kind of interrupts, Joseph's story, at least momentarily. Let's read chapter 38 of Genesis. See how all this fits together. Genesis chapter 38 starts on page 42 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. It was at this time that Judah went off from his brothers and settled near a man named Hirah, who was an Adulami. There Judah saw one of the daughters of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and slept with her. She conceived and had a son whom he named She conceived again and had a son, and she called him Onan. Then she conceived again and had a son whom she called Shelah. He was in Kaziv when she gave birth to him. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil from Adonai's perspective, so Adonai killed him. Judah said to Onan, "Go sleep with your brother's wife. Perform the duty of a husband's brother to her and preserve your brother's line of descent." However, Onan knew that the child wouldn't count as his. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground so as not to give his brother offspring. What he did was evil from Adonai's perspective, so he killed him too. Then Judah said to Tamar's daughter-in-law, "Stay a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, I don't want him to die too, like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived at home with her father. In due time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And after Judah had been comforted, he went up to be with his sheep shearers in Timnah, he and his friend Hirah the Adulami. Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law has gone up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she took off her widow's clothes, completely covered her face with her veil, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, but she still was not being given to him as his wife. And when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute because she'd covered her face. So he went over to her where she was sitting and said, not realizing she was his daughter-in-law, "Come, let me sleep with you." And she answered, "What will you pay to sleep with me?" He said, "I will send you a kid from the flock of goats." And she said, "Will you also give me something as a guarantee until you send it?" He answered, "What should I give you as a guarantee?" She said, "Your seal, with its cord and the staff you're carrying in your hand." So he gave them to her, then went and slept with her, and she conceived by him. She got up and went away, took off her veil, and put on her widow's clothes. Judah sent the kid with his friend, the Adulami, to receive the guarantee items back from the woman, but he couldn't find her. He asked the people near where she had been, "Where's the prostitute who was on the road to Enaim?" But they answered, "There hasn't been any prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and he said, "I couldn't find her." Also the people said, "There hasn't been any prostitute here." Judah said, "All right, let her keep the thing so that we won't be publicly shamed. I sent the kid, but you couldn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been acting like a whore. Moreover, she's pregnant as a result of her prostitution." Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned alive." And when she was brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law: "I am pregnant by the man to whom these things belong. Determine, I beg you, whose these are, the signet, the cords, and the staff." Judah acknowledged owning them. He said, "She is more righteous than I, because I didn't let her become the wife of my son Shelah." And he never slept with her again. And when she went into labor, it became evident that she was going to have twins. And as she was in labor, one of them put out his hand. And the midwife took his hand and tied a scarlet thread on it, saying, "This one came out first." But then he withdrew his hand, and his brother came out. So she said, "How did you manage to break out first?" Therefore he was named Peretz. Then out came his brother with the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was given the name Zerah. The story suddenly shifts for a while. We're back to Canaan, and it concentrates now on the brother whose suggestion it was to sell Joseph into slavery, Judah. Now, some of what we read in this chapter about sons marrying brothers, widows, and so on may sound strange to us. For now, we just need to accept it as we read it, because this is simply normal custom for that time. Some of this chapter's importance for us is to help us understand the mindset and the customs of that era. It was vitally important to people then, and even in tribal cultures of today, by the way, that family bloodlines are carried on. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. First of all, though, I'd like to focus on Judah, because it was out of Judah that would come the Jewish people and the eventual Messiah, Yeshua. That is, Judah would now carry the torch as the continuing line of covenant promise that began with Judah's great-grandfather, Abraham. Judah was Jacob's fourth son. He was a son of Leah, one of the two legal wives of Jacob. Jacob's first four sons were all born by Leah. Now, in trying to figure out why Judah was mentioned so prominently in the previous chapter as the one who perpetrated the selling of Joseph, and now in this chapter as the one who thought he was sleeping with a prostitute, but instead it turned out to be his widowed daughter-in-law, we need to take notice of the state of the family of Israel, the clan of Jacob. It's entirely possible and probable that Judah had viewed his brother, or better, half-brother, Joseph, as a rival. Now remember, Judah was born to Leah, Joseph was born to Rachel. Why a rival? Because Judah may have seen himself as the one now due the firstborn blessing, and then therefore all the wealth and all the authority that went with it. Why would he think that? Now, as we're going to see later, Jacob had decided that Reuben, even though he was Jacob's firstborn son, would not receive that firstborn blessing because Reuben had slept with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. And Simeon and Levi, the next two in line, were also deemed unworthy to inherit the firstborn blessing Reuben forfeited, because they were the two who led that raid on the males of Shechem, killing them in revenge for the rape of their sister Dinah. So it would naturally seem to follow that Judah, fourth in line, he would become the inheritor of that firstborn blessing. But Joseph, having been given that tunic of royalty and being openly favored by his father, appeared to indicate to Judah's mind that Jacob was leaning towards, maybe he'd already decided, to bypass his first 10 sons, which of course included Judah, and give all rights and authority to the clan to Joseph. This, of course, would not have settled well with Judah. Well, here's the irony of all this. This wrestling for power that the teenage Joseph was utterly oblivious to was but the beginning of the rivalry between Judah and Joseph, or better yet, between their descendants. For these two brothers represent those people who would eventually become the two dominant tribes of Israel, Judah and Ephraim. Some of you are probably saying, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about Judah and Joseph. How did Ephraim jump in here? Well, as we're going to see in a few chapters, Ephraim, an Egyptian-born son of Joseph, that is, he was born to Joseph's Egyptian wife, would effectively replace Joseph as a tribe of Israel. In fact, Jacob would actually adopt Ephraim and his older brother Manasseh away from Joseph for the purpose of replacing Reuben. And centuries after that, Judah and Ephraim would become the two Israelite kingdoms that were created after the split of the nation Israel as it existed under David and Solomon. And the descendants of Judah and Ephraim would find themselves warring against each other off and on until Assyria finally conquered the northern kingdom of Ephraim, and they scattered the 10 tribes of Israel, which constituted Ephraim, throughout the far reaches of Asia and some parts of northern Africa. So beginning from the time Joseph was a young man, right on through to today, the descendants of Judah and the descendants of Joseph by way of Ephraim have been at odds with one another. It's interesting. In the prophecy of Ezekiel 37, it says that a time is foretold during which Israel will cease to exist as a nation and then be reborn again as a nation back in its land, in the land of its beginnings. Further, that Judah and Ephraim will come back to the land and be ruled under one king, a descendant of King David for all time. Judah, the Jews, returned to the Middle East in 1948, reconstituted the nation of Israel in the same place it was before it was destroyed some 2,000 years earlier. But what of Ephraim? Well, those Joseph tribes have been making the news as of late. We have traditionally talked of the 10 lost tribes of Israel when referencing the tribes of Ephraim. Ephraim had not returned to Israel, Judah had. Well, for several years now, large tribes of people scattered around Asia and particularly over near India have been claiming that they are some of those lost tribes. After nearly 20 years of investigation, the Jewish religious leadership of Israel has determined they are indeed Ephraim. And they have convinced the Israeli government of that fact. So as of March 2005, some of these tribes of Ephraim have been invited to immigrate to Israel. The prophecy of Ezekiel 37 is actually underway. But there's still a problem. The Judaism that modern Jews practice is different to varying degrees than the way these various Ephraimite tribes often practice their beliefs in Torah. Just as it started with the man Judah and the man Joseph, and it has happened since Judah sold Joseph into slavery and he wound up in Egypt, Judah and the Joseph tribes, going currently by the name of Ephraim, are still at odds. Judah, the Jews, have told Ephraim they must adopt Jewish traditions and basically convert to Judaism in order to return to Israel. Those of Ephraim, many who are desperate to come to Israel, many of them have grudgingly agreed. But you can bet this isn't the end of the story. I suspect that as the return of Ephraim heats up, so is resistance going to be to adopting the ways of Judah. We'll see. We're going to continue with this chapter next time.